Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria by Winston S. Churchill. Today, 125 years ago, the future Prime Minister reported from the fronts of the Boer War in South Africa. We shall follow his footsteps as he narrates his adventures himself. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 23, The Passage of the Tugela. Hospital Ship, Maine, March 4, 1900.
Since I finished my last letter on February the 21st, I have found no time to sit down to write until now, because we have passed through a period of ceaseless struggle and emotion, and I have been seeing so many things that I could not pause to record anything. It has been as if a painter prepared himself to paint some portrait, but was so fascinated by the beauty of his model that he could not turn his eyes from her face to the canvas, only that the spectacles which have held me have not always been beautiful. Now the great event is over. The long and bloody conflict around Ladysmith has been gloriously decided, and I take a few days' leisure on the good ship Maine, where everyone is busy getting well, to think about it all and set down some things on paper. First and foremost, there was the Monte Cristo Ridge that we had captured on the 18th, which gave us the Green Hill, Hlangwani Hill, and, when we chose to take it, the whole of the Hlangwani Plateau. The Monte Cristo Ridge is the centerpiece to the whole of this battle. As soon as we had won it, I telegraphed to the Morning Post that now at last success was a distinct possibility. With this important feature in our possession, it was certain that we held the key to Ladysmith, and though we might fumble a little with the lock, sooner or later, barring the accidents of war, we should open the door. As Monte Cristo had given Sir Redvers Buller Hlangwani, so Hlangwani rendered the whole of the western section, the eastern section was already in our hands, of the Colenso position untenable by the enemy, and they, finding themselves commanded and enfiladed, forthwith evacuated it. On the 19th, General Buller made good his position on Green Hill, occupied Hlangwani with Barton's brigade, built or improved his roads and communications from Hussar Hill across the Gamba Valley, and brought up his heavy guns. The Boers, who were mostly on the other side of the river, resisted stubbornly with artillery, with their Vickers Maxim guns and the fire of skirmishers, so that we suffered some slight loss, but could not be said to have wasted the day. On the 20th, the south side of the Tugela was entirely cleared of the enemy, who retired across the bridge they had built, and moreover, a heavy battery was established on the spurs of Hlangwani to drive them out of Colenso. In the afternoon, Hart's brigade advanced from Chievely, and his leading battalion, under Major Stuart Wortley, occupied Colenso village without any resistance. The question now arose, where should the river be crossed? Sir Redvers Buller possessed the whole of the Hlangwani Plateau, which fills up the re-entrant angle made opposite Peters by the Tugela after it leaves Colenso. From this Hlangwani Plateau, he could either cross the river, where it ran north and south, or where it ran east and west. Sir Redvers Buller determined to cross the former reach beyond Colenso village. To do this, he had to let go his hold on the Monte Cristo Ridge and resign all the advantages which its possession had given him, and had besides to descend into the low ground, where his army must be cramped between the high hills on its left and the river on its right. There was, of course, something to be said for the other plan, which was advocated strongly by Sir Charles Warren. The crossing, it was urged, was absolutely safe, being commanded on all sides by our guns, and the enemy could make no opposition except with artillery. Moreover, the army would get on its line of railway and could advance along the railroad. This last was a purely imaginary advantage, to be sure, because the railway had no rolling stock, and was disconnected from the rest of the line by the destruction of the Tugela Bridge. But what weighed with the commander-in-chief much more than the representations of his lieutenant was the accumulating evidence that the enemy were in full retreat. The intelligence reports all pointed to this situation. Boers had ridden off in all directions. Wagons were seen trekking along every road to the north and west. The camps between us and Ladysmith began to break up. Everyone said, "This is the result of Lord Roberts' advance. The Boers find themselves now too weak to hold us off. They have raised the siege. But this conclusion proved false in the sense that it was premature. Undoubtedly, the Boers had been reduced in strength by about 5,000 men, who had been sent into the Free State for its defense. Until the Monte Cristo Ridge was lost to them, they deemed themselves quite strong enough to maintain the siege. When, however, this position was captured, the situation was revolutionized. They saw that we had found their flank and thoroughly appreciated the significance and value of the long, high wedge of ground, which cut right across the left of their positions and seemed to stretch away almost to Bulwana Mountain. They knew perfectly well that if we advanced by our right along the line of this ridge, which they called the Bush Kop, supporting ourselves by it as a man might rest his hand on a balustrade, we could turn their Peter's position just as we had already turned their entrenchments at Colenso. Therein lay the true reason of their retirement, and in attributing it either to Lord Roberts's operations or to the beating we had given them on the 18th, we made a mistake, which was not repaired until much blood had been shed. I draw a rough diagram to assist the reader who will take the trouble to study the map. It is only drawn from memory, and its object is to show how completely the Monte Cristo Ridge turned both the line of entrenchments through Colenso and that before Peters. But no diagrams, however exaggerated, would convince so well as would the actual ground. In the belief, however, that the enemy were in retreat, the general resolved to cross the river at A by a pontoon bridge and follow the railway line. On the 21st, therefore, he moved his army westward across the Hlangwani Plateau, through his bridge, and during the afternoon passed his two leading infantry brigades over it. As soon as the Boers perceived that he had chosen this line of advance, their hopes revived. "Oh," we may imagine them saying, "if you propose to go that way, things are not so bad after all." So they returned to the number of about 9,000 burghers and manned the trenches of the Peters position, with the result that Wynn's Lancashire Brigade, which was the first to cross, soon found itself engaged in a sharp action among the low kopjes and suffered 150 casualties, including its general, before dark. Musketry fire was continuous throughout the night. The 1st Cavalry Brigade had been brought in from Springfield on the 20th, and on the morning of the 22nd, both the regular and irregular cavalry were to have crossed the river. We accordingly marched from our camp at the neck between Singolo and Monte Cristo and met the 1st Cavalry Brigade, which had come from Chevigi at the pontoon bridge. A brisk action was crackling away beyond the river, and it looked as if the ground scarcely admitted of our intervention. Indeed, we had hardly arrived when a staff officer came up and brought us orders to camp near Hlangwani Hill, as we should not cross that day. Presently I talked to the staff officer, who chanced to be a friend of mine, and chanced, besides, to be a man with a capacity for sustained thought, an eye for country, and some imagination. He said, "I don't like the situation. There are more of them than we expected. We have come down off our high ground. We have taken all the big guns off the big hills. We are getting ourselves cramped up among these kopjes in the valley of the Tugela. It will be like being in the Colosseum and shot at by every row of seats." Sir Redvers Buller, however, still believing he had only a rear guard in front of him, was determined to persevere. It is, perhaps, his strongest characteristic, obstinately to pursue his plan in spite of all advice, in spite, too, of his horror of bloodshed, until himself convinced that it is impracticable. The moment he is satisfied that this is the case, no considerations of sentiment or effect prevent him from coming back and starting afresh. No modern general ever cared less for what the world might say. However unpalatable and humiliating a retreat might be, he would make one so soon as he was persuaded that adverse chances lay before him. To get there in the end was his guiding principle. Nor would the general consent to imperil the ultimate success by asking his soldiers to make a supreme effort to redress a false tactical move. It was a principle which led us to much blood and bitter disappointment, but in the end, to victory. Not yet convinced, General Buller, pressing forward, moved the whole of his infantry, with the exception of Barton's brigade, and nearly all the artillery, heavy and field, across the river, and in the afternoon sent 2 battalions from Norcott's brigade and the Lancashire Brigade to the vacant command of which Colonel Kitchener had been appointed, forward against the low kopjes. By nightfall, a good deal of this low, rolling ground was in our possession, though at some cost in men and officers. At dusk, the Boers made a fierce and furious counterattack. I was watching the operations from Hlangwani Hill through a powerful telescope. As the light died, my companions climbed down the rocks to the cavalry camp and left me alone staring at the bright flashes of the guns which stabbed the obscurity on all sides. Suddenly, above the booming of the cannon, there arose the harsh, rattling roar of a tremendous fusillade. Without a single intermission, this continued for several hours. The howitzer battery, in spite of the darkness, evidently considered the situation demanded its efforts, and fired salvos of lyddite shells, which, bursting in the direction of the Boer positions, lit up the whole scene with flaring explosions. I went anxiously to bed that night, wondering what was passing beyond the river, and the last thing I can remember was the musketry drumming away with unabated vigor. There was still a steady splutter at dawn on the 23rd, and before the light was full-grown, the guns joined in the din. We eagerly sought for news of what had passed. Apparently, the result was not unfavorable to the army. Push for Ladysmith today. Horse, foot, and artillery was the order. Both cavalry brigades to cross the river at once. Details were scarce and doubtful. Indeed, I cannot yet give any accurate description of the fighting on the night of the 22nd, for it was of a confused and desperate nature, and many men must tell their tale before any general account can be written. What happened, briefly described, was that the Boers attacked heavily at nightfall with rifle fire all along the line, and, in their eagerness to dislodge the troops, came to close quarters on several occasions at various points. At least 2 bayonet charges are recorded. 16 men of Stuart Wortley's composite battalion of reservists of the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifles showed blood on their bayonets in the morning. About 300 officers and men were killed or wounded. The Boers also suffered heavily, leaving dead on the ground, among others a grandson of President Kruger. Prisoners were made and lost, taken and rescued by both sides, but the daylight showed that victory rested with the British, for the infantry were revealed still tenaciously holding all their positions. At 8 o'clock, the cavalry crossed the river under shell fire directed on the bridge, and were massed at Fort Wiley near Colenso. I rode along the railway line to watch the action from one of the low kopjes. A capricious shell fire annoyed the whole army as it sheltered behind the rocky hills, and an unceasing stream of stretchers from the front bore true witness to the serious nature of the conflict, for this was the third and bloodiest day of the 7 days' fighting called the Battle of Pieters. I found Sir Redvers Buller and his staff in a somewhat exposed position, whence an excellent view could be obtained. The general displayed his customary composure, asked me how my brother's wound was getting on, and told me that he had just ordered Hart's brigade, supported by 2 battalions from Littleton's division, to assault the hill marked 3 on my diagram, and hereinafter called Inniskilling Hill. I have told Hart to follow the railway. I think he can get round to their left flank under cover of the riverbank, he said, but we must be prepared for a counterattack on our left as soon as they see what I'm up to. And he then made certain dispositions of his cavalry, which brought the South African light horse close up to the wooded kopje on which we stood. I must now describe the main Pieters position, one hill of which was about to be attacked. It ran, as the diagram shows, from the high and, so far as we were concerned, inaccessible hills on the west to the angle of the river, and then along the 3 hills marked 3, 2, and 1. I use this inverted sequence of numbers because we were now attacking them in the wrong order. Sir Redvers Buller's plan was as follows. On the 22nd, he had taken the low kopjes, and his powerful artillery gave him complete command of the river gorge. Behind the kopjes, which acted as a kind of shield, and along the river gorge, he proposed to advance his infantry until the angle of the river was passed and there was room to stretch out his, till then, cramped right arm and reach round the enemy's left on Inniskilling Hill, and so crumple it. This perilous and difficult task was entrusted to the Irish Brigade, which comprised the Dublin Fusiliers, the Inniskilling Fusiliers, the Connaught Rangers, and the Imperial Light Infantry, who had temporarily replaced the Border Regiment, in all about 3,000 men, supported by 2,000 more. Their commander, General Hart, was one of the bravest officers in the army, and it was generally felt that such a leader and such troops could carry the business through if success lay within the scope of human efforts. The account of the ensuing operation is so tragic and full of mournful interest that I must leave it to another letter.
This concludes today's reading of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, by Winston S. Churchill. Join us also tomorrow for the subsequent chapter. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thanks for listening, and so long.